So, welcome to my session. Today, I'm going to talk to you about Kubernetes, and I'm going to talk about the complexity of Kubernetes and how we can simplify deploying it and configuring it at the same time, right, through infrastructure as code. And I'm going to demo a tool that we have at Microsoft that we've built that's available to everyone to help you basically configure your deployment and your configuration at the same time, and it generates code for you. So let's dive in. So a little bit about me. I'm based in Minnesota, in the US, and it's pretty dark here right now, and we're getting ready to head into our winter season. So but it's still fall. But I'm hoping to come to Nigeria at some point and present in person, meet all of you, hang out with Kazim. Now, I work for Microsoft. I'm a principal program manager, and I'm a part of Azure engineering. I've authored, 8 books. So everything from System Center to AKS and hybrid cloud. Um, and I do a ton of stuff on Pluralsight. So I have 17 courses out there now. So if you're interested in training, go out there and definitely check that out. I have a lot of stuff out there on Kubernetes and a lot of other various things like Python was my most recent course. But if you want to follow me or interact or engage, you can follow my blog there at bucatech.com, or you can follow me on Twitter at bucatech. So this is what we're going to dive into specifically as we go through my session here. So first of all, and let me see, since I can see the crowd, by show of hands, how many of you know what Kubernetes is? I see a few hands. How many of you are working with Kubernetes right now? Awesome. What about containers like Docker? Are any of you working with containers? I see some head nods. I see some hands. So if you're not exploring like containers and Docker and Kubernetes, I highly recommend you just get involved with it. It's all open source stuff. So you can work with it on your own. You can work with it across any of the clouds. You could load, Docker on your local machine and start working with containers today. And if you're developing software, or even if you just take an application, you can actually containerize that and start working with containers. It's a huge part of the cloud native story, and just like cloud in general and open source. And so it's a very important technology, and it's really good from a skill set and a job and career perspective. So I'm going to tell a story through some memes. So there's a running joke that if there's any problem that needs to be solved, you just throw Kubernetes at it. And that's what this comic is about. And so containers and Kubernetes have become wildly popular, right, in businesses. And so there's been mass adoption. It's still growing. There's a huge interest in it. Schools are teaching it. There's a lot of online resources, books, et cetera, right? And so with that, all the cloud providers jumped on the bandwagon and decided to simplify Kubernetes by making cloud offerings. And so you have these managed Kubernetes services where you can go deploy basically Kubernetes cluster without having to go through all the pain of deploying it on your own. So you can see here, like Azure's listed, of course, AWS, Google, and a bunch of other cloud providers. So there's also been simplified ways to deploy Kubernetes, even like on your local machine through like Minikube. And so a lot of organizations have made the attempt to try to simplify Kubernetes. But I want you to meet someone. I want you to meet John. John is 22 years old. He's been working with Kubernetes for a couple of years. And he started out deploying Kubernetes on-prem. And he's been deploying Kubernetes in the cloud and working with it in the cloud, and he's no longer stressed out by Kubernetes. So, of course, this is a joke. Like, John's not a real person, but this just kind of illustrates, how complex Kubernetes can be. And then this is kind of like the experience when you go to deploy an application on Kubernetes, right? You got all these moving parts and things that you have to do. And then, we all set out to, like, the cloud providers and organizations set out to make managed Kubernetes services to simplify it. And it has been greatly simplified. It's much, much better than deploying Kubernetes on your own servers, but it's still complex. And that's what this little comic here is trying to illustrate. So, you start here, everything looks good. People tell you it's awesome, like me. I'm telling you how awesome Kubernetes is. And then you're like, great, let me dive in. And then you go to create, let's say, like AKS. And so you dive in, you start deploying your apps, and then you're like, oh man, now I got to worry about all this stuff. And these are all things that you have to be aware of or work with or utilize when you're working with Kubernetes. And then at the end, you kind of, you realize what you've gotten yourself into. And so here's a sample architecture of Kubernetes, well, AKS specifically, on Azure. And you can see there's a lot of moving parts. And our cluster specifically is right here. And you can see that we're actually running like multiple namespaces, but you could see all these other cloud components that surround Kubernetes, right? And even some DevOps components. We have some Docker here that actually are needed as a part of your AKS architecture or running your application, right? And here's another example of an architecture for running Kubernetes. This one's a little less complex, but still, you can see our Kubernetes cluster here, and then you can see all these moving parts that are all cloud services that are needed to help basically run your application that's running on Kubernetes, because you're not going to just spin up a Kubernetes cluster, deploy your application to it, if your end users don't have a way to get to it, right? So you need all of these additional components to route the traffic into your Kubernetes cluster. And so the last slide I want to show you here around kind of the Kubernetes complexity is a snapshot of the Kubernetes ecosystem. Now, I say this is a snapshot because there's many more like add-ons or additional applications out there to try to help simplify or streamline or enhance like Kubernetes, either deploying it or running it. And you can see here in this list, these are different aspects that we need to think about when we go and deploy Kubernetes in production. And so we have our governance and policy, identity stuff, how are you going to carve up permissions? Where are your accounts going to live, right? Your automation. So you're going to need to deploy your applications to Kubernetes, right? So we have things like GitOps here. We have Terraform. You're going to need to log and monitor the health of your cluster and your applications. And then the platform itself, there's many flavors of Kubernetes. So there's Kubernetes, there's Red Hat OpenShift. You could run Kubernetes on some of the other clouds. I mean, there's a lot going on here, right? And your traditional aspects of tech don't go away. You still need compute and storage, and you still need networking, right? So Kubernetes under the hood, the nodes are virtual machines. They're servers. So you don't get away from servers. Kubernetes just abstracts that away from you. And so you still have to worry about things like storage, because you're going to be storing some data on your Kubernetes clusters, networking, right? Traffic still needs to get into your cluster and to your applications. So there's a lot of stuff to actually think about that don't just go away just because you're running containers. And so I love this tweet because this embodies how I feel when I have to explain Kubernetes to someone, right? This tweet is hilarious to me, right? So when I try to explain Kubernetes, like sometimes it causes more confusion because of the complexity there. But I don't want to scare you off if you haven't taken the leap into Kubernetes or containers. It's very rewarding as far as like performance, speed. You can spin up containers a lot faster than servers. There's a lot of portability. There's a tremendous amount of benefits. And from a career perspective, it will do wonders for your career because companies are adopting the technology and they need people to be able to run Kubernetes. So I don't want to scare you off from it, but I just wanted to illustrate the story of like, it is complex, right? So it takes time to ramp up and really learn how it works. So what I want to go into next is just, I'm going to give you an overview of AKS, that's Microsoft's Kubernetes service. And this is going to be great for those of you that aren't working with Kubernetes yet. And it's going to be great for those of you that are working with Kubernetes, or maybe you've dabbled in it, because this is going to be a good starting point. And so AKS is basically a managed Kubernetes service. And so you go into the Azure portal, and we're going to do a demo of this, and you just spin it up. And then once it's spun up, there's configuration, but you can start deploying workloads to it. And also it spins up the servers that are powering the nodes in the Kubernetes cluster. We'll talk about what those are, right? And it just reduces the management overhead of running your own. And Microsoft manages part of it, right? So the agent nodes, you still have to do some things with. You don't have to do everything, like if you were running it yourself. And Microsoft manages the control plane nodes. And so also with AKS, you get some deep integration with things like Azure Active Directory for RBAC controls. So if you have your user accounts and your groups in there, you can use those to log into your Kubernetes cluster. Azure Networking, Azure Policy for policy and compliance enforcement, Defender for cloud for security, right? Even Azure Storage. If you're running stateful applications, so if you have applications like databases and you're running those as containers, you can store that data on Azure Storage, which gives you a lot of flexibility and capabilities. Azure Container Instances, as well as GitOps, right? And that brings me to my next slide, where we can build and deploy our containerized applications through Azure DevOps, or we could even use things like GitHub, right? And GitHub Actions, and deploy from our code in those repositories all the way to our AKS clusters in a seamless fashion. Or if you're utilizing GitOps, you can use that as well. And actually AKS has some integration, first-class integration with GitOps, specifically Flux. Now I'm going to get into some of the nuts and bolts of AKS, so some of the deeper architecture. I'm going to try to get through this fast because I want to get to the demo, and I want to talk about the tool that helps you simplify all of this. So in Kubernetes, we have this concept of our cluster, right? We have control plane nodes and we have agent nodes. And so our control plane is what runs like Kubernetes and some of the core components like API server. This etcd is a database, the scheduler for scheduling the pods, which are the workloads, and more. And then we have kind of our client side nodes. And this is where our workloads are actually running, okay? That's a high level of the architecture. From a network perspective, when it's running in Azure, we have our Azure virtual networking. And then we have our node here. That's what this would be. And this just interfaces with this Azure networking. But this node also can interface with like Azure storage. And then we have our containers running here. We have our container runtime running here as well. And then from a Azure Active Directory perspective, I'm not going to dive into this real deep, but essentially Azure AD is able to talk directly to Kubernetes API server. And so it's able to do the access and authorization. I think I said that right. And in Kubernetes, this is a Kubernetes concept, not just AKS, but you have something called namespaces. And we can actually carve out namespaces on our Kubernetes cluster, and we can have different namespaces and carve out like permissions to those namespaces, and we can run certain workloads in those namespaces. So I could have a namespace called marketing for my business, and I could run WordPress there. And I could say only my marketing users can access the WordPress containers. That's just an example, right? You'd never give your marketing folks access to your underlying hardware, or I mean infrastructure, but you get the point. And then storage. So in Kubernetes, you can have pods, and you could have persistent volumes. And again, we could use Azure storage there. This gets a little bit more into the networking. And so your pods, they are containers, and there's a bridge, and they're able to interface with, right, Azure's virtual networking. Now, there's two types of network models that are available in basically Kubernetes and in AKS. I'm not going to get into that because we could do a whole session on just that. And I want to be careful with the amount of time that we have today. Now, when you're running your workloads, right, your pods, which your containers run in your pods, you need to have a way for end users to be able to get into those pods, right? And so that's what we call ingress. And that's essentially that incoming traffic that's coming into your pods. And so there's a few different ways to actually handle the ingress. The default way for incoming traffic is to have it come into a load balancer. And when the traffic comes into the load balancer, and in the case of Azure, that's an Azure load balancer. That load balancer then is going to send that traffic on to the appropriate node, and the appropriate node is going to have a Kubernetes service running on it, and that will send the traffic to the appropriate pod. So think of your web application, for example, running back here, and then you have your end user out here that's trying to get to your website, and the traffic starts in here, and it just kind of flows through this path. Now, we can have something called ingress controllers that run here instead of a load balancer. And the same thing, right? We have end users that are trying to get to, let's say, a website, for example, and the traffic flows in. Now it hits an ingress controller, and an ingress controller is smarter. So it's able to process like more logic, has more functionality. So you can see we have URLs here. And so that ingress controller can send it to specific services or just do more things, right? In the aspect of like routing traffic back to our pods if we have more complex scenarios. Now, here's just a list of ingress controllers. So you probably recognize some of the names on here, like F5, Nginx is very popular. And so the point of this is just there's a lot of options out there for ingress controllers. Most of them are open source. And so that's the beauty of Kubernetes and AKS is you can grab a lot of open source technologies to power your solution. Scaling in Kubernetes is a big thing. It can automatically scale for you. So let's say if you're running a business or you're the tech, you're in the tech department for an organization and they have some sort of marketing campaign. And so there's a lot of additional traffic that's hitting maybe the websites that your organization runs, right? And so you don't want things to fail. And if you're running it on Kubernetes as containers, your website, things can automatically scale as needed without a person having to go, without you having to go scale up or scale out. right? And so Kubernetes has a couple of options for scaling. So there's something called the horizontal pod autoscaler. And what this does is it will actually scale out pods for you, right? So you might have 2 pods running. Maybe your user traffic increases. Oh, was there a question? No? Okay. Maybe your traffic increases, and so you need more pods to be able to handle the increased load, right? And so Kubernetes will recognize that the load is increasing, and it will start to scale out more pods for you. You also have a cluster autoscaler, and what this does, it actually scales out more nodes. So let's say your nodes, which are your virtual machines, are maxed out because the load on them currently. AKS will automatically deploy more virtual machines, and then your pods will be deployed on those new virtual machines, right? So that's the power of Kubernetes, and well, one of the many benefits of it, and one of the reasons a lot of organizations are adopting it, because this stuff happens automatically, or what I like to say, automagically. There's something else here, burst to Azure container instances, and this is specific to Azure, right? Let me go back here. This is specific to Azure. And what this is, if you need to do scaling, instead of just scaling more nodes, so deploying more virtual machines, it will actually scale to what's called a virtual node, and it will deploy Azure Container Instance. Now, we haven't talked about ACI, but all that is a PaaS service, right? Platform as a service that runs in Azure that can run containers. And it's a lot lower cost. And so this is way more economical if you just need to burst for a short amount of time, more resources. And so with AKS, you're able to do that as opposed to just deploying more nodes. All right, so that was the overview of AKS and a little bit of Kubernetes. There was a lot there, right? I'm going to try to get to a point where we can open it up for questions at the end, so I'm going to keep going. But now we're going to talk about a tool called the AKS Construction Helper. If we think back to all the slides that I just went through, right? There's a lot of architecture, and that was just Kubernetes. I didn't even touch on like all the other components that are running in Azure that you need to help run your workloads on Kubernetes. And so when you need to go deploy that, it can be complex, and it can it can be stressful, right? Let's think back to the picture of John, who was 22, joking. And he'd been running Kubernetes for a while, right? There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of complexity. So the AKS Construction Helper is a wizard-driven tool that helps you basically specify the configuration of your deployment as well as the configuration of your cluster, and then it generates the code for you. And so this allows you to build your AKS deployments out in code, and it allows you to build the supporting Azure architecture out in code. So when you deploy Kubernetes, you typically need a container registry. You need an Azure virtual network. You might need some storage. You need an ingress controller. You might need Azure policy. You might need Defender for Cloud, right? So there's all these moving parts. Well, the AKS Construction Helper can help you deploy those other things too, like a container registry. And this tool is following the guidance here that we publish, right? So we have a few frameworks and some guidance in the AKS Secure Baseline, the Well-Architected Framework, the Cloud Adoption Framework, and Enterprise Scale, right? This tool has taken the pros and cons and the best practices from all of those different guides and frameworks, and it's baked into this tool. And so it simplifies your life from that aspect as well, because you know you're deploying secure AKS clusters if you're using this tool, and that it adheres to what is in those frameworks. And so you're basically going through a wizard. And I'll show you the tool here, but this is what it looks like. You're doing checkboxes, you're configuring, you're entering names, and at the end of it, it spits out code, right? And this is what it looks like. And we'll look at it. Here's the URL to get to this tool. Okay. So this is a free tool. It's available to anyone. Any Azure customer can go out there and use this. And this is an example from the tool of configuring your cluster. So like your cluster name, your version, your region that you're going to deploy into, what your seeder for your IP addresses is going to look like. Do you want this integrated with, AKS firewall? And there's a way to integrate it with Azure Active Directory in the tool as well. And then you have these different tabs for configuring the different configuration aspects of your cluster. And there's just a short list of the things that you would configure. And again, these are all things that you need to think about when you're deploying Kubernetes. And I said Kubernetes, not just AKS, because those are things you need to think about, even if you were to go deploy Kubernetes on AWS or GCP or even on premises. So when you configure your Kubernetes cluster, at the end of it, it gives you code, right? That's the output it gives you. And so let's dive into a demo here. And I'm going to switch over to my browser. So let's get to my browser here. And this is the tool. This is a pre-configured link of a Kubernetes deployment that I set up ahead of time. And that's something you can do too. You can go and configure your Kubernetes cluster, and then you can get the link and come back to it at any time. So if you're working on it and you're like, I need to take a break or I'm done for the day, you can get the link and you can come back to it later. And so you can see here, there's check boxes, right? So if you wanted just a bare bones cluster, you would click that. Or if you wanted a managed environment, you would click that, right? If you want additional security controls, like here's the Azure Active Directory integration, you go ahead and check this, and it's going to add that into your cluster configuration, right? If you wanted a private cluster, so the API server is not open to the internet, you would check that right there. Now, with each one of these, it's going to give you different options. And so some are going to be more complex and some are going to be less complex. But what happens is, as you check these things, as you check those boxes, your configuration down here changes. So let me check this just to show you. And let's see, let me check this here. And so if we were to go to like cluster details, let's do our add-on here. So if I check this and I go through and I scroll through, there's certain options that it automatically selected for me, right? And I could still go through and configure this in greater detail. But these boxes up here are going to modify what's here in our configuration down there. So just to kind of show you, right, you also could come in here and you could say, I want to deploy this to, let's see here, what would be the nearest region? Maybe Middle East. So you could say, I want to deploy to this region, or maybe you want a different region, right? Maybe you want to change the name of this cluster. You just change it right there. You could actually change the seeder here. So maybe you want a different range for your IP addresses. And then you could come over here and you could say, hey, I need the SLA. This is a production cluster. So configure that for me automatically. Here's your auto scale. So you could say, I want this to be able to scale from 1 to 36 nodes. right? Here's my node size. So these are the virtual machines. So you could configure that. You could say, I don't want Azure Active Directory integration. I just want to use Kubernetes RBAC, right? You could say public IP with no restrictions. So you could go through and configure all these different things. Also on the add-on tab here, we could say, I want an Nginx ingress controller deployed with my cluster automatically. I want logging through Azure Monitor, or I just want Prometheus and Grafana, right? So there's all these different aspects. I want to deploy Keta, which is an add-on for Kubernetes for event-driven workloads. So there's all these different things that you can configure. And once you're done with that, and I know there was a lot there, right? So that comes with spending time learning Kubernetes and the different aspects. And those things will make more sense. But when you're done, here's your command line. And so literally you can just copy this code and go run it in Azure. And that's what I'm going to do. You also have these other options. You could run this as a GitHub action, or if you're using Terraform, here's your Terraform code, right? So here's all of your Terraform code, your main.tf. Here's your variables.tf file. And then here's your Azure provider, right? So it generates all this code for you, and it generates it based on the configuration that you set in here, okay? Now, I typically like the Azure command line. It works really, really well. And if you're not ready to deploy this yet, again, you could click on this link right here. So at the bottom, you can click on this, and it'll bring you to a link here, and you can actually copy this and save it. And you can come back to that link later, and it will bring up your configuration exactly as you left it. Now, this doesn't like save anywhere specifically. It's actually putting the configuration in the link. So you have to keep that in mind. So if you come back here in the future and you make more configurations, then you have to come down here and click this link again. And what that's doing is it's just generating a new link for you. So make sure you keep that in mind. Now, I'm over here on Azure, and I don't know if my session, it's still there. So I'm over here on Azure. I have the Cloud Shell open, and I just click that to open it, right? And I'm just going to show you the experience of deploying a Kubernetes, an AKS cluster using the code from the AKS construction helper. So I already pre-staged my code from the tool, right? So I have all that already ready to go. And so I'm just going to paste that in here, and it's just going to fire away. So as this is going, I think we could probably open it up for questions, but I want to, show you this, and you'll start to see momentarily that it's going to create my resource group. And I have Tech Summit here, so it should show up as soon as it gets to that point. There it is. So it created that resource group already, and it's doing all that from code. And then if we open the resource group, we'll start to see things populate in here. So there's my public IP address, and you're gonna, it's pretty fast. So you can see it deployed some managed identities for me. It deployed the log analytics workspace. It's got my virtual network down here. It deployed a Azure container registry for me. That's where I would store my containers for my workloads. And so you can see it start to working already. Now, the thing that takes the longest is actually deploying the Kubernetes cluster itself. And so this takes a while. This does take about 10 minutes. We probably don't have time to see it all come in, but I at least wanted to show you that this is, deploying stuff. So here is my application gateway ingress controller that deployed that already. And I think the thing that it will deploy after that is our AKS cluster. So I see that we have like 3 minutes left. I want to open it up for questions. So let's do this. Kazim, are there any questions from the audience? I don't know if you have audio where you can ask those questions, but I want to take a few minutes and answer any questions that anyone might have.
All right. Thank you very much, Steve. So Steve will take your questions now. All right. Please.
So I just want to ask why Kubernetes?
Did you hear that, Steve? Why Kubernetes? Somebody is asking.
Oh, why Kubernetes? Great question. So part of the reasons you would use Kubernetes is because containers are much faster than virtual machines. For example, I could have the same application, and if I deploy it on a virtual machine, I have to like install all of the dependencies of that application on that virtual machine, on that operating system. Also, if I have to restart the server, right? I'm sure you've done this. You have to wait, right? It might take 2 minutes, might take 3 minutes, it might take 5 minutes. When you have your application running on a container, in the container, you only have the dependencies that you need for that application and the base layer of that operating system. And so you might go from a 2-3 minute startup time to 30 seconds, and then your application is running and live. So containers have a benefit there. They're much faster, they're way more lightweight, and they're portable. Now, if you have thousands of containers, let's say, or even hundreds that you're running in your organization, you need a system to help you manage all of that, right? To move those containers around on different servers, aka nodes, to be able to start them up, take them down, deploy the networking components in them, scale them, all of that stuff. So that's where Kubernetes comes into play, and it takes care of all of that for you automatically. You just tell Kubernetes what you want it to do, and you configure that through code. Once you set those settings, then Kubernetes will do that stuff for you. So if a pod fails, if it dies, because a node doesn't have enough resources, it will spin up that container on another node automatically for you. So it does things like that. It also helps with the journey to DevOps. And so from a coding perspective, you're able to code everything in Kubernetes, from your networking to your storage to the auto scaling to your monitoring. And so it really helps from a DevOps perspective and helps you get much closer to full automation.
Pricing, virtual
Okay.
machines.
Okay, thank you, Steve. So the last question I think we can entertain because of time. Somebody is asking now that how about pricing, comparing
Virtual machines, VMs.
okay, AKS versus VM on Azure or
Then
just
it's
on.
soft copy.
Oh, okay. So I'll just try. All right, I'll try to merge the two questions now. So one is pricing, comparing VM to AKS, and they're also asking if they can get a copy of your presentation slide.
Yes, you can get a copy of the presentation slides. I'll send that to Kazim and he'll be able to share it. As far as pricing, so Kubernetes itself, or actually AKS itself, does not cost anything. Okay. However, if you're using storage, that costs money, right? If you're using cloud storage, you're using virtual networking, that costs money. Remember, the nodes are virtual machines, so you're paying for those virtual machines. And so you could use really small nodes to drive the cost down, or you could use very large nodes, which will drive the cost up. And so AKS itself doesn't cost anything, but the stuff that runs AKS is what costs you money. So you could go and look at running 2 virtual machines and compare that to running AKS with 2 nodes. The cost is going to be a little different because you might have virtual networking, you might have some different things in AKS that you may or may not have with your virtual machines. But at the virtual machine level, the cost is going to be the same. And part of the reason for this is because Kubernetes is open source. So you could go download Kubernetes today. You could deploy it on your own server. You don't have to pay any licensing costs. You could run your containers. You don't have to pay any licensing costs for that, right? So cloud providers typically don't charge for the managed offering of Kubernetes, but they charge for the resources that you're consuming.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Kazim. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day, and thanks for coming to my session.
Yes, enjoy the rest of your day, Steve.
All
Bye-bye.
right. Bye.